Well, it's always a good thing to come out and support this cause. I think it's worthwhile to come out and enjoy yourself with the people. The people's enjoy it and they support this. And for me, it's an honor to come out and do this.
Well, these guys is old-fashioned, so, you got to take it slow with these guys here, I know they don't want to bounce around too much like our group we got down there, but, a little bit in and out, let them know it's okay, casual way. I want to do it kind of slow. If you get them kind of doing something kind of slow, we'll get through today.
Someone once called him the funniest man in baseball. Fast as anything the game had seen. 2 World Series rings. He's effing useless, he said about a teammate once, and everyone laughed. Only Mickey Rivers could say that and walk away untouched. But decades later, witnesses testified in a federal courtroom that he had been taking instructions from a mob figure on which games to throw. Nothing looked funny anymore. Today we are covering the 7 biggest feuds Mickey Rivers left behind. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. If you want more baseball stories that go this deep, hit the hype feature right now and give this video some hype while we get into everything Mickey Rivers left behind. Because these 7 conflicts tell a story that most fans never got to hear the full version of, and we are going to tell every single one of them. Was Mickey Rivers just the funny guy in a loud and chaotic clubhouse? Was he simply the speedy leadoff man who set the table and kept the lineup moving? Or was he the kind of person who could quietly ruin your season, your career, or your reputation without ever raising his fist in a way that showed up on the police report? The answer to all 3 of those questions is yes, and the evidence is in the 7 conflicts below. You might not love everything you find, but you will not be able to look away from any of it. Born on the 30th of October 1948 in Miami, Florida, Rivers grew up in economically difficult conditions in South Florida and was raised primarily by his grandmother, Flora Fambro. She was the constant in his life. He attended Northwestern High School in Dade County, a school with a serious reputation for producing professional baseball talent. It had sent numerous players to the major leagues long before Rivers arrived, and he was one of the most impactful products that school ever produced. He made his major league debut with the California Angels on the 4th of August, 1970, called up while outfielder Alex Johnson was away on National Guard duty. General manager Dick Walsh immediately identified Rivers as the franchise's premier young outfield prospect. What made him genuinely unusual was the contrast between how he carried himself and what he was actually capable of once the game began. His teammate Sandy Alomar gave him a nickname that became permanently attached to him for the rest of his playing days. He called him the Almighty Tired Man. Rivers walked to the plate with a hunched and shuffling gait, moving like a man who had not slept properly in a week and was not entirely sure why anyone had scheduled a baseball game today. His posture communicated exhaustion, his pace communicated deep personal reluctance, and then the pitch was thrown and the ball was in play, and every single thing changed in an instant. The speed was explosive and immediate. The athleticism was elite. The bat flip was quick and personal. He was a completely different creature once the game was moving, and no opposing defense was ever fully ready for that first step. Off the field, the life around Mickey Rivers rarely stayed quiet for very long. At one point, his wife deliberately drove her Mercedes-Benz into his Cadillac during a dispute in the Yankee Stadium parking lot. 2 expensive cars, a very public venue, and Mickey Rivers somewhere in the middle of the wreckage. That particular brand of chaos had a documented tendency to locate him, regardless of the city or the standings. Before the 1976 season, the Yankees traded Bobby Bonds to the California Angels and received Rivers and starting pitcher Ed Figueroa in return. Rivers gave New York elite speed, constant offensive pressure, and the ability to manufacture runs that Bonds simply could not provide. The Bronx Zoo clubhouse, defined by Steinbrenner's controlling ownership, Billy Martin's volatile management, and media scrutiny so relentless that minor disagreements became morning headlines, was already at boiling point when Rivers arrived. He did not just survive in that environment. He read it at a level most teammates never matched. He was never performing without purpose. And in a clubhouse already loaded with volatile personalities and ready to ignite, Rivers did not simply endure the chaos. He lit matches. Number 7, Mike Richert. Most people who know the name Mickey Rivers think of the version of him that makes them smile. The quotable comedian with the sharp instinct for the perfect line at the perfect moment. The eccentric center fielder who could diffuse any room or any situation with a single sentence delivered in the right tone. That image was real. The wit was genuine and it was fast. The humor served him well in New York and built a reputation that outlasted his career. But there is one story from the end of his playing days that strips that comfortable image away completely. It happened not in the spotlight of New York, not during a championship run with the whole country watching, not in a situation where comedy could walk back into the room and make everyone forget for what had just occurred. It happened on a commercial flight in Texas, years after the protective mythology of the Bronx Zoo had been left behind, and what it revealed about Rivers had nothing funny in it whatsoever. After being traded to the Texas Rangers late in the 1979 season, Rivers found himself in a quieter and very different kind of organization. There were no World Series titles creating a safety cushion for difficult personalities. There was no national media circus large enough to reframe every conflict as entertainment. It was a baseball team trying to compete in a smaller market under real pressure with players who were carrying their own individual fights for job security. The Bronx Zoo had given Rivers a certain kind of shelter. Texas did not offer any of that. Without championships and without a media cycle large enough to swallow every difficult story, the dynamics of that Rangers clubhouse operated on more ordinary rules. People competed for jobs. Tensions between veterans and younger players had real consequences. And when conflicts happened, they were not transformed into entertaining folklore the way they had been in New York. They were just conflicts with ordinary and permanent outcomes. In April of 1983, underlying tension between players on the team erupted into physical violence on a charter flight home. Rivers became involved in a violent fistfight with a young Rangers second baseman named Mike Richert. Richert was not a seasoned veteran with a long history of confrontations behind him. He was a highly regarded prospect who had led the American Association with a batting average of .354 in 1981. He was working every day to establish himself as the Rangers' permanent starting second baseman. His whole career as a professional was still ahead of him, and he was giving everything he had to prove he had earned his spot. Richert later attempted to manage the public narrative by describing the confrontation as a minor misunderstanding, the kind of thing competitive people occasionally get into in high-pressure environments. But what happened to his career in the months that followed made any attempt to downplay the incident sound hollow and unconvincing. After the fight, Richard's performance fell off rapidly and significantly. By the end of April, his batting average had dropped to .194. The Rangers moved quickly. They removed him from the starting lineup, installed a player named Wayne Tollison in his place, and sent Richert back to the minor leagues. He was eventually traded to the Houston Astros in May of 1984 and never secured regular starting status in the major leagues again. A young player with documented minor league credentials and a genuine chance at a career ends up in a confrontation with Mickey Rivers on a plane, and the direction of his professional life changes permanently that same night. The fight did not just set Richert back temporarily. It broke the forward momentum he had spent years building, and the organization's response clarified the power dynamics in a way that left no room for interpretation. When an established veteran and a younger player without job security clash physically, the organization almost always removes the one it values less. Richert was not the asset the Rangers were protecting. There is a structure inside professional sport that rarely gets discussed openly because it is uncomfortable. Veterans have political capital. Younger players without guaranteed contracts do not. When a confrontation happens between those two groups, the resolution almost always follows the same path. The organization calculates which player it needs more and removes the one it can afford to lose. Richert had done nothing to earn that outcome in any sporting sense. He was simply on the wrong side of a power imbalance when the moment came. And Rivers, whether he understood that dynamic consciously or simply knew instinctively how clubhouse politics worked, was on the protected side of it. Rivers was never just fast feet and funny lines. He could cause permanent damage to the people around him. The Richert incident makes that undeniable, and it stands as a reminder that the reputation built in New York was always only half the picture. The other half was waiting for the right moment to show itself. Number 6, George Steinbrenner. George Steinbrenner was never a player. He was never a manager. He was the owner, and in the context of Mickey Rivers' career, he represents arguably the most consequential conflict of all of them, because what happened between these two men did not simply close one chapter of Rivers' playing career. If you take seriously what was later testified in a federal court, their conflict was potentially a cover story for something far darker and far more dangerous than any ordinary personality clash between a stubborn owner and a difficult player. Steinbrenner ran the Yankees with a grip so tight on discipline and public image that the organization felt his control in every corner of the operation. He wanted his players to look a specific way, behave a specific way, and carry the franchise's public identity in a manner that matched his own aspirations for what the Yankees should represent. Mickey Rivers, in nearly every observable way, was the opposite of the Yankee Steinbrenner was trying to build around himself. The apparent casualness in Rivers' playing style drove Steinbrenner to frustration. The poor plate discipline was a constant irritant, and Rivers' well-documented love of horse racing and his broader gambling habits were a source of ongoing tension for an owner who believed his players' focus and energy belonged exclusively to the team and to no one and nothing else. Their mutual friction built slowly through Rivers' years in New York and eventually reached a visible breaking point during the 1979 season. In those final months as a Yankee, something shifted in Rivers' game that was noticeable to anyone watching closely. He stopped taking aggressive leads off first base, which had always been one of his most effective tools. At the plate, he appeared flat and disengaged in a way that went beyond his usual and familiar performative lethargy. There were moments when he looked to coaches and players paying attention, like a man who had already decided which at-bats he was going to lose before he reached the box. Steinbrenner's had seen enough, and he traded Rivers to Texas, publicly attributing the move to the player's attitude and deteriorating performance. That was the official story for years. Two strong personalities reaching a natural breaking point. An impatient owner running out of patience with an undisciplined player. A separation that made professional sense given everything that had built up between them. Then the federal courthouse produced a different account entirely. During a trial in the early 2000s involving a minor organized crime figure, state witnesses testified under oath about what had allegedly been taking place inside the Yankees organization during the 1979 season. The testimony described Rivers as having accumulated deep gambling debt with bookmakers who maintained connections to organized crime. The mob-associated figure at the center of the case claimed he had personally traveled to Yankee Stadium on multiple occasions during that season to tell Rivers which specific games to throw. To be clear and precise about this, these were witness testimonies delivered in a federal proceeding, not established facts proven against Rivers personally. He was not charged with any criminal wrongdoing, but the testimony exists as part of the public court record. And when you read those words alongside what was visible on the field, the passive base running, the surrendered at-bats, the disappearance of the competitive fire that had defined his game for years, a deeply uncomfortable picture comes into focus. What the public saw as a clash between a difficult owner and an undisciplined player may have been something far more serious. A man buried under gambling debt to people who did not accept excuses and who had very specific ideas about how he was going to pay them back. His conflict with Steinbrenner, which was the version the world discussed, may have been the least important thing happening to Mickey Rivers during that entire period of his life. Number 5, Bobby Bonds. The connection between Mickey Rivers and Bobby Bonds does not involve a confrontation or a public argument. There was no shouting match between them, no incident that made headlines. Their connection is a trade. But that trade and the way people inside the organization talked about what it meant tells you something significant about the kinds of environments where Rivers' energy was useful and the kinds of collateral damage that same energy left behind. Before the 1976 season began, the Yankees sent Bobby Bonds to the California Angels. In return, they received Mickey Rivers and starting pitcher Ed Figueroa. Bonds had genuine talent and provided real offensive production. But the strikeout numbers were high, and the Yankees had decided they wanted a different profile leading off. Rivers was the answer they chose. Speed that pressured defenses constantly. A contact approach that kept every inning alive. The ability to manufacture something from nothing in a way that changed how the opposing pitcher had to work through the entire lineup. Yankees insiders who were part of that organization throughout the championship years and consistently described Rivers and Bonds as representing opposing types of clubhouse personalities. Bonds operated with a structured and predictable professional presence. Rivers was catalytic, volatile, and capable of changing the atmosphere of a room in any direction at any moment with very little warning. The Yankees had made their choice. They decided Rivers' particular brand of combustible energy was the better fit for the organization they were assembling around Steinbrenner and Martin. And in the narrow measurement of championship results, that decision produced exactly what they wanted. The interesting thing about that trade is what it said about the Yankees' priorities. They were not simply swapping one outfielder for another. They were choosing a personality type. They were deciding that combustible, unpredictable energy was worth more than steady production. And in the short term, the championships proved them right. Rivers arrived, and the organization won back-to-back World Series titles in 19 77 and 1978, he set the table at the top of the lineup. He stole bases and manufactured pressure before the big hitters came to the plate. He was what they had paid for. But Rivers did not carry his energy only to the parts of the game where it helped win baseball games. He carried it everywhere, all the time, and the people who were in the wrong place at the wrong moment were not insulated from it by anything. The next person on this list felt the full weight of that reality during one of Rivers' worst moments. Number 4, Goose Gossage. Rich Gossage came to New York in 1978 carrying enormous expectations. He had signed a significant contract. The Yankees needed him to be the reliable closer they had paid for, and the pressure to deliver immediately was immense from the moment he arrived. What unfolded in his first handful of appearances was nothing short of a disaster. Gossage blew multiple saves in his opening outings. Over his first 3 appearances, he gave up 5 runs on 10 hits, with 3 of those hits leaving the park as home runs. In New York, in that organization, in that media environment, struggling through your first 3 games was not treated as a normal adjustment period. It was treated as a crisis, and the cameras and the coverage reflected that completely. The panic reached all the way down to the ground crew. The stadium workers responsible for driving the motorized bullpen car from the outfield to the mound, when a relief pitcher was summoned, reportedly began arguing amongst themselves about who would be required to drive Gossage. Nobody wanted to be the person putting him in position to blow another one. Then came a game where the Yankees held a lead they absolutely could not lose. Billy Martin raised his hand from the dugout and called for Gossage. The bullpen car started its drive from the outfield. Mickey Rivers, positioned in center field, watched that car coming and made a very deliberate choice about what to do next. He sprinted from his spot, reached the bullpen car before it had traveled much distance, and threw himself onto the hood with both arms spread. He pressed his face directly against the windshield and screamed at the driver and at Gossage that nobody wanted Gossage to come in and that they did not want to lose this game. Gossage told this story for decades with genuine warmth and affection for the memory of it. It became one of the most loved stories from the entire Bronx Zoo era, quintessentially Mickey, only possible in New York. An outrageous piece of physical comedy that nobody else would have attempted. Take the laughter away and read the moment again honestly. A veteran player ran across a live baseball field and screamed his fear and his lack of confidence in a teammate's ability to do his job in front of tens of thousands of fans and a television audience watching at home. He did not pull Gossage aside quietly after the game and share a concern. He did not go to the manager privately. He made his anxiety into a full public event, and the person at the center of that event was Gossage, whose professional credibility was being loudly questioned in front of everyone in the stadium. The comedy was undeniable. The humiliation underneath it was equally undeniable. Rivers expressed his fears through performance. He turned his anxiety into entertainment, which meant the person at the center of it absorbed the embarrassment while Rivers collected the laughter. It worked as a coping mechanism. It was also a way of controlling the room at someone else's expense. And it pointed directly to a pattern that ran through every relationship Rivers had with people who made him feel uncertain or threatened. Number 3, Billy Martin. Billy Martin was one of the most gifted and most destructive people in baseball. On a tactical level, he was brilliant, capable of squeezing results from his roster that other managers could not have found. Away from the field, he was a recurring emergency, feuding with ownership, with players, with members of the press, and occasionally with people who had no connection to baseball at all. He was fired and rehired by the Yankees more than once in a sequence of events that would have been impossible to believe if it were not all documented in public. Rivers and Martin had a relationship built on something genuine but specific. They recognized in each other a shared intensity about winning that was rare and extreme. Rivers respected Martin's tactical intelligence and the absolute fierceness he brought to competition. Martin knew how to deploy Rivers' talents without destroying what made him effective. They were not friends in the warm sense of the word. They were two people at the same table who understood exactly what game they were playing and how the other one operated. Rivers watched Martin's perpetual war with Steinbrenner with real amusement. The cycle of confrontations between the manager and the owner was both exhausting and entertaining. And Rivers watched from a distance, never particularly worried about outcomes that did not involve him. He was the one person in the entire organization who seemed to find the whole arrangement genuinely funny rather than stressful. Maybe because he understood better than most that chaos was not something to be managed. It was something to be used, and he had been using it his entire career. When journalists pressed Rivers to explain how an organization could possibly function with Steinbrenner and Martin running things at the same time, Rivers gave them the answer that has been repeated ever since. He said, "Me and George and Billy were two of a kind. 3 people. 2 of a kind." The arithmetic was deliberately wrong, and that was the whole point. Think about what that quote actually does. It does not explain the chaos. It does not try to make sense of the dysfunction the way a frustrated player might in an interview. It absorbs the chaos. It treats the whole messy arrangement as something already understood, already categorized, already filed away as funny. Rivers was not confused by the Bronx Zoo. He was narrating it. And in placing himself alongside the owner and the manager as one of 3 people who were somehow 2 of a kind, he was telling every journalist in that room exactly where he believed he stood. Not below Steinbrenner, not below Martin, alongside them, a co-equal voice in a very loud story. In 6 words, Rivers had placed himself inside the highest levels of the Yankees' power structure and claimed equal footing with the owner and the manager, without raising his voice or making a single argument. He did not present himself as a confused player trying to understand his superiors. He presented himself as a co-equal character in the same story, the difference being that he had already figured out the story was a comedy and found it thoroughly entertaining. Martin and Steinbrenner were 2 powerful men in a constant battle over control. Rivers narrated the battle from the center of it and found the whole thing hilarious. Number 2, Cliff Johnson. Cliff Johnson arrived at the Yankees mid-season in 1977 to provide right-handed power to a lineup that needed it. He delivered on that front, but Johnson also brought a reputation that had followed him through every clubhouse he had ever been in. Short fuse, physical when provoked. The kind of player who made teammates measure their words carefully when he was nearby. In a room full of significant personalities, Johnson was still genuinely imposing. Mickey Rivers chose mockery as his approach, not confrontation, not avoidance. Aggressive, appearance-based public ridicule aimed at the most intimidating person in the room, delivered loudly and repeated enough to become part of the clubhouse wallpaper. He told reporters and teammates that Johnson was so ugly he should be made to wear an oxygen mask at all times. The room laughed. Johnson was the punchline in a joke he had no good way to answer. This was a strategy with a history. Rivers had used the same approach before with a former player named Danny Napoleon, saying Napoleon was so ugly that walking past him would make your trousers wrinkle and that he caused fly balls to curve foul. When Rivers encountered someone who represented a potential threat to his standing, whether physical or social, cosmetic ridicule was a reliable weapon. It worked because it put the target in a position with no clean exit. Respond physically and confirm every negative perception of yourself. Laugh along and hand the moment to Rivers completely. Either direction led to the same outcome, which was Rivers walking away in control of the situation. What it looked like to an outsider was sharp clubhouse comedy. What it was underneath the laughter was a deliberate tactic for public domination. The laughs were genuine. The calculation behind them was just as genuine. Consider the specific target Rivers kept returning to with this approach. He did not go after players who were already marginalized or easy to dismiss. He went after the ones who were physically imposing, short-tempered, or socially dominant in ways that most people handled carefully. Johnson was genuinely intimidating. Danny Napoleon had apparently made an impression that warranted a response. Rivers consistently chose the people who would cost something to confront directly and then found the specific angle that made direct confrontation entirely unnecessary. That is not the behavior of a man who is simply funny by nature and stumbles into good lines. That is the behavior of a man who has thought carefully about how power works in a closed environment and developed a specific method for managing, and Johnson was not the first person to experience this from Rivers and was not going to be the last. The interesting thing about Rivers' use of this tactic is how rarely people called it what it was. Because it was delivered with genuine wit, and because the lines were genuinely funny, the content was absorbed as entertainment rather than aggression. The room laughed, the journalists wrote it down, and the story passed into baseball culture as evidence of Rivers' genius for comedy. What it was also evidence of is that he understood perfectly how to cause damage in a way that looked like a gift. Number 1, Reggie Jackson. If there is one moment from the entire Bronx Zoo era that has genuinely outlasted everything else from that period of baseball history, it is the exchange between Mickey Rivers and Reggie Jackson. That exchange has been quoted in books, discussed in documentaries, and repeated in baseball conversations for nearly half a century. It deserves every single piece of that lasting attention because it is one of the most precisely constructed public humiliations in the history of professional sport, and it happened in the middle of a workday with cameras pointed at both of them. Reggie Jackson arrived at the Yankees as a high-profile free agent who was wealthy, nationally famous, and completely certain of his superiority over the people sharing his clubhouse. He made this certainty known in a way that did not invite debate. He alienated teammates through constant self-promotion. He gave interviews that made the players around him feel like supporting cast in his personal story. He cultivated a public image that was designed to position him as the single most important person in any room he chose to enter. Then he told reporters that he possessed an IQ of 160. Mickey Rivers heard that claim. He paused and then asked with complete calm and complete precision, "Out of what, 1,000?" 5 words. The quote became instant folklore, and it has never stopped circulating. The reason it has lasted is not simply because it landed as a joke. It is because of the surgical accuracy of the attack. Jackson had been trying to establish intellectual superiority over his teammates. Rivers did not challenge the specific number or debate what constituted a high IQ. He implied instead that the scale on which Jackson was measuring was so enormous that the number itself became meaningless. In one dry question, he transformed Jackson's boast into evidence of delusion rather than intelligence. Jackson had no clean response available. Rivers had moved too quickly and landed too precisely. But the feud had much further to run. During the 1977 season, Jackson was navigating a televised slump with reporters and cameras nearby at every turn. The New York pressure made ordinary struggles into public spectacles, and Jackson was feeling all of it. In that moment, with reporters positioned nearby and the interaction being observed, Jackson turned to Mickey Rivers and told him publicly that Rivers needed to dedicate more time to learning how to read and write. Read that carefully. A wealthy and nationally celebrated player, in front of reporters and cameras, publicly questioned his own teammates' literacy as a way of managing the pressure he himself was under. This was not a private frustration expressed in the privacy of a locker room. It was performed deliberately for the people watching. Jackson believed the power dynamic and the visibility of the moment would protect him from the consequences. Rivers responded with a line more devastating than the IQ comeback because it was more personal, more specific, and targeted something Jackson had invested years in building. He said it was no wonder Jackson was all mixed up because he had a white man's first name, a Spanish man's second name, and a black man's third name. People still quote those words today because they did something extraordinary. Jackson had built his entire public identity around being a figure of universal appeal, above racial and cultural divisions, belonging to everyone and to no particular group. Rivers dismantled that construction in a single sentence and suggested that the confusion Jackson projected onto others was actually Jackson's own unresolved internal conflict, sitting right there in plain sight for anyone willing to name it. He took the brand Jackson had spent years constructing carefully and publicly suggested it was held together by nothing more substantial than ego and denial. This was not just a clever response to a cruel comment. It was a complete assertion of social authority in the most visible space available. Rivers refused at every turn to allow Jackson's salary, his fame, or his national media profile to give him power over the people around him in that clubhouse. Every time Jackson reached for superiority, Rivers pulled him back down to the same ground level as everyone else, in front of witnesses, without apparent effort. The wit was the mechanism. Control was the actual goal. But look honestly at both sides of that exchange and at the whole pattern of behavior it represents. Jackson's literacy comment was cruel and publicly staged. Rivers' response was equally cruel, more personal, and even more publicly staged. Both men were using humiliation as a competitive weapon in front of an audience. The wit makes Rivers' line. Quotable and quotable lines are what get passed down through baseball generations. But underneath the brilliance of the comeback was a man who had located the most vulnerable point in another person's sense of self and pressed on it hard in public because he had the skill to do it and the willingness to follow through. So who was Mickey Rivers when you look at all of it together? He was a player of real and undeniable brilliance. 2 World Series championships as a genuine contributor, not a passenger. A career batting average of .295 across a long career. After leaving New York, he produced one of the finest seasons of his entire playing career with the Texas Rangers in 1980 Batting, 360 overall, 419 in late inning pressure situations, 455 with the bases loaded, and 327 in day games across the American League. Those numbers belong to a player who was still operating at an exceptional level long after the championship years were behind him. His major league career ended on the 30th of September, 1984, with one of baseball's quietest possible closings. California Angels pitcher Mike Witt threw a perfect game, a final score of 1-0 on the very last day of the regular season. That was the last game Mickey Rivers ever played as a major leaguer. No farewell tour, no ceremony, just a perfect game from the other side, and then a walk back to the dugout for the last time. Sabermetrician Bill James later placed Rivers 59th on his list of the greatest center fielders in baseball history. That ranking belongs to a genuinely special player who earned serious standing in baseball history. But the Richert fight is in the record permanently. The federal court testimony about gambling debt and games allegedly thrown sits in the public record. The Gossage incident, endlessly entertaining in the retelling, sits in the record as a public humiliation disguised as comedy. The consistent pattern of using public ridicule as a domination strategy sits in the record. And the Reggie Jackson, brilliant as every word of it was, also sits in the record as proof of what Rivers was willing to do to a person when he decided they needed to be taken down. Talent does not cancel toxicity. They sit next to each other, and sometimes they make each other stronger in ways that create lasting damage. Rivers was funnier because the stakes were real and the pressure was constant. His wit was sharper because he had genuine things to protect. He was more dangerous to the people around him because he had fewer limits on what he was willing to do when he felt threatened. The humor and the harm came from exactly the same place, in exactly the same person, at exactly the same time, with exactly the same intention. And yet the baseball record is also real. 2 World Series titles. A career that Bill James evaluated seriously enough to place in the top 60 at his position in the entire history of the game. A 1980 season in Texas that belongs in any conversation about the finest individual performances of that era. The running, the base hits, the manufactured runs, the moments where he made the impossible look routine because he moved so fast nobody had time to react. All of that is real too. You do not have to choose between the two versions. They are both the same person. That is what makes the story worth telling 50 years later. What a player. What a mess. What a story. If you made it through all 7 of these feuds, leave a comment below and tell us which one surprised you the most. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, right now is the moment to fix that. There are more stories like this one ready for you, and you do not want to be the person who misses them.